Hi, I'm John Hornick. Welcome to lesson 54 of Chef's Apprentice, learning to cook like a pro, one small plate at a time. This lesson is roasted butternut squash soup with Mirin caramelized mushrooms. For this soup, you will learn to roast a squash. The same technique used to make the soup can be used to make a squash puree, which can be used as a base or an accompaniment for a protein-based dish, or as a ravioli filling, which we'll do in a later lesson. You will also learn a new but very important technique, browning mushrooms. You will saute the mushrooms until they brown and start to chirp when pressed into the pan. They really do chirp. Techniques today are seeding and roasting squash, chopping and slicing, seasoning, sauteing, browning mushrooms, deglazing and caramelizing, sweating a mirepoix, bringing to a boil, simmering and pureeing, adjusting, seasoning and keeping warm, plating, and garnishing. So let's start cooking. Okay, let's talk about the mise en place for lesson 54. Star of this show is a butternut squash. These are very easy to work with. First, we're going to cut it in half. Now, the description says to have one that's been halved and seeded. Now, I'm just going to do that for you since we haven't done that in the course. So I just cut it in half, very simple. Then just take a spoon and scoop out all of the seeds. Okay, that's all you need to do to prep the squash. I'll do the other one a little bit later on. There's some fibers in there. You know, you can try to get those out if you can, but it's not really that important. Okay, I will also need about 1/2 cup of chopped shallots, about 1/4 cup of chopped celery, about 1/4 cup of chopped carrots. Then we'll need some dry vermouth. Now, I've said that whenever we need white wine, we can use dry vermouth. And today we're going to use the dry vermouth intentionally. We'll need about 1/2 cup of that. I'm just going to eyeball it when we get to that step. We'll need to have about 2 cups of stock. Now, this is chicken stock. You could use vegetable stock. And remember, we make our own stock in this course, and there are separate lessons on that. We'll also need to have about 1/4 cup of Calvados. Now, Calvados is sometimes also called apple brandy. We need to have some olive oil and about 1 cup of fairly thinly sliced mushrooms. These are about 1/8 of an inch thick. We need to have some aged balsamic vinegar, and also we'll need to have about 1/4 cup of mirin. Now, I'm just going to eyeball that when we get to that step too. And kosher salt and peppermill. And then we'll need to have about 1 tablespoon of chopped parsley. I have more than that here, but I'm just going to use what I need. It's just going to be used to sprinkle on at the very end. All right, that is all of the ingredients. We will come back. I'll show you the equipment. Okay, for equipment, we're going to need a cutting board and a chef's knife. We'll need a peeler to peel the carrots and a spoon to spoon the seeds out of that squash. We'll need a brush to brush oil in our sheet pan, and some toothpicks so we can test the doneness of the butternut squash. Also need to have a skillet, a couple of wooden spoons, and a saucepan to make the soup. We'll be needing a blender to puree the soup. We're using the Ninja blender today. We'll need to have a spatula, a rubber spatula, and a strainer to push that soup through the strainer so we get a nice smooth pureed soup. And we'll need to have a ladle and some bowls. Haven't picked the bowls yet. We'll do that later. So right now, come back and start cooking. Okay, the first step on the prep list is to preheat the oven to 350 degrees. I've already turned it on. Now we need to brush the squash and the pan with olive oil. And again, we've talked about this before. You could aluminum foil pan. I don't use aluminum foil very much because I'm trying to keep my carbon footprint a little bit lower. So I oil the pan, makes it easier to clean later. So we're just going to give some little salt and pepper onto the squash. And then we're going to oil the pan. Okay, now we're going to place the cut sides of the squash down on the sheet pan. And then we're going to put this into the oven, 350 degrees, for about an hour. Okay, the idea is to get it to be really soft so that when we push a toothpick through there, especially in this thick part here, we don't have the seed cavity. We want the toothpick to go through very easily. So into the oven for an hour. Okay, so it's been an hour. The squashes are looking beautiful. They're kind of blistered on the outside. That's a good sign. Toothpick goes into the solid part very easily, very smoothly. Now what we're going to do is just let this cool enough so that we can remove the squash from the skin. So it's going to take, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes or so until it's cool enough to handle. Okay, so while the squash is cooling, we are going to brown the mushrooms. So we're going to put a little olive oil in the pan. I'll probably put in about, a tablespoon, maybe a little bit more. We want to get the pan hot. Okay, so we're getting some smoking from the oil. We're going to add a little bit of salt and pepper. And we want to brown these mushrooms. Try to keep some space between them. If they're too crowded, they won't brown. Now mushrooms will initially absorb all of the oil in the pan, and then they'll start to release it back into the pan. So initially they'll look very dry. Then they'll start to look a little bit more moist. So we're starting to get some browning. Now when the mushrooms are starting to get to the point where they are properly browned, you can push them into the pan and you'll hear a little chirping noise. Yep, I don't hear it yet. Nope, I heard it on that one. Hear it a little bit here. It's like a little chirping sound when you press it into the pan. Okay, these look nicely browned. Now I'm going to add a little mirin, about 1/4 cup. We're going to let those cook. The sugars in that mirin are going to caramelize on the mushrooms. We'll turn down our heat a little bit to low. You can see the bubbling in the pan. That's the moisture in the mirin disappearing, leaving the sugars behind. Getting a nice kind of a glaze on those mushrooms. Nice caramelized glaze on those mushrooms. We're going to let that cook until it's almost dry in the pan. We don't want it to start to get totally dry and to burn. So they're looking good. I'd say right now they've got a nice color to them. We're going to let these cool a little bit and then we're going to coarsely chop them off heat. Right now I think the squash is cool enough that we can handle it. Look at that. Look how caramelized the surface of that squash is. It's beautiful. And I want to try to keep that if I can. Okay? Now what we're going to do is just use a spoon and scrape this squash out of the skin. We're going to throw the skin away and try to get as much of it as I can. Okay, now if there's any big pieces, I want to break them up. Good. Okay, now this is ready to go into with the mirepoix. Okay, now we're going to sweat the mirepoix to make the soup. We go on to medium heat. Add some olive oil, a couple tablespoons of olive oil to the pan. And then we're going to add the shallots, celery, carrots, and then a little bit of light seasoning, light salt, light pepper. Now I'm using the ground pepper in this dish because I like the little black specks of the ground pepper in this dish. You could use, if you don't want those black specks, you could use white pepper. Now, a lot of the black specks will be taken out when you strain it, but it depends upon how fine your strainer is. If you're not, I'm not using a real fine strainer, so some of those black specks are going to go through the strainer. If you're using a real fine mesh strainer, you know, it might not matter. The black specks might not, the pepper pieces might not come through. All right, so we're going to sweat this until they're translucent. Okay, our mirepoix looks nice and translucent. We're going to deglaze with about a half a cup of dry vermouth, and we're going to let that evaporate until it is almost dry. Another way of saying it is just wet. In other words, you look at those mirepoix vegetables and they're not dry, they're just wet. Okay, so I can see that this is just wet, almost dry, not much liquid left in there. Now we're going to add the roasted butternut squash. And I want to get as much of this caramelization on the pan as I can. Now I want to add enough stock to cover the squash. Now I want to bring this to a boil on a little bit higher heat, medium to medium-high. And then after it comes to a boil, we're going to reduce and simmer it for about 10 minutes. Now we want to coarsely chop these mushrooms. They're just going to be a little garnish on the top of each one of the little bowls of soup. Remember, we are doing a small plate, so each person is getting a fairly small amount of soup. Each person is getting a fairly small amount of the mushroom garnish. Okay, so we've just come to a boil here. We're now going to reduce the heat and simmer for about 10 minutes. Okay, now we're going to we're going to puree the soup in the blender. And remember, we always put a towel over the top. And we're going to puree it till it's smooth. Okay, let's see how it looks. Oh, it looks beautifully smooth. All right, next thing we're going to do is strain this back into a clean pot. I just took the pot that I cooked the soup in and I rinsed it out. We're going to strain it back into that pot. Okay, we have our clean pot. We're going to add the strainer there. Pour the soup into the strainer. And then push the soup through the strainer with the rubber spatula. Remember to clean off the bottom of your strainer. There could be there's a lot of soup there. It could be a whole serving. Now back to the stove. All right, the next thing on our prep list is to add the Calvados, bring it to a boil, and then simmer it for 5 to 10 minutes. All right, so we're going to put in about 1/4 cup of this Calvados. We're just going to eyeball that. And stir it up. Now this soup is looking to me to be a nice thickness. Now some people like a thinner soup, some people like a thicker soup. This is good for me. If yours is too thick, thin it with more stock or water. Now let's bring this to a boil and let it simmer for 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, we are just coming to a boil. Now we're going to reduce the heat to low and simmer it for 5 to 10 minutes. That's mostly to just cook off the alcohol from the Calvados. Simmer 5 to 10 minutes. All right, we've been simmering for about, I might say about 7 minutes. Now we're going to taste it for purposes of adjusting the seasoning. I think it needs a little bit more salt. Add a little more salt to it. Stir it up. Let's taste it again. Perfect. Saltiness is just slightly coming through. All right, it is now time to plate up. Okay, so we're going to ladle some of the soup into our bowl. Now remember, depending on whether you're serving 4, 6, or 8 people, you're going to have to proportion this, portion the soup so everyone gets their fair share. We're going to garnish with a little bit of the Mirin caramelized mushrooms right in the center. Then a little drizzle of your balsamic vinegar. You can tell your guests when they eat this either to mix it all up and eat it, or to take a little soup, a little mushroom, a little balsamic vinegar. That's the way I like to do it. And then we do a little bit of parsley. And there we have it. That's the conclusion of lesson 54, roasted butternut squash soup with Mirin caramelized mushrooms. You can see photos of the final dish at my Instagram, which is at Chef's Apprentice, Cook Like a Pro. Next up is the pasta master recipe. We're going to be making pasta from scratch. Don't miss this one, because you're going to learn that you can make pasta from scratch faster than you can cook dried pasta from a box. You have to watch the lesson to learn about that. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.